every town. Gas masks are being distributed. Get to cover. Get under cover at once. The enemy are not in any great force, and our anti-aircraft gunners will speedily dispose of them.
In 1936, a British feature film, Things to Come, imagines what the next war will be like. It shows what millions fear, a war different from any before, with fleets of bombers attacking civilians from the air. Only 1 year later, the prediction is coming true. In the war in China, Japanese planes bomb Shanghai. And in Europe, thousands of civilians are bombed in the Spanish Civil War. Across the world, the nature of war has changed. From now on, civilians will be targets. In 1939, with war about to break out in Europe, civilians expected to be attacked in their homes or at work, and tried to prepare for the new sort of war.
Earth is energetically shoveled into bags by willing hands and piled against key buildings.
It wasn't just high explosives they feared, but gas attacks too.
Such scenes as these are familiar not only to us, but to the peace-loving citizens of every country in Europe.
Now I'm getting very fond of me gas mask, I declare. It hardly ever leaves my side. I sling it on me back and I take it everywhere. It even comes to bed at night. My sister had a lot of socks to mend, so she gave me a fat bouncing baby to tend. And when I felt it leaking at one end, well, I did what I could with me gas mask.
With Adolf Hitler's invasion of Poland in September 1939, the war in Europe began. Young men across the continent said their farewells.
La Hollande est en armes. La loyale Belgique, soucieuse de sa sécurité, mobilise. Le gouvernement français rappelle plusieurs classes de réservistes.
But this time, children said goodbye to their families as well and left the cities. They had to be saved from the obliteration expected from the skies. Mothers like Elizabeth Finn in London feared the worst.
I thought we were all going to be dead. The horror was about being bombed, being separated. Supposing my husband and I are killed, who's going to look after my children? And when I saw all the young girls walking along arm in arm, laughing and talking, I envied them, I did. I thought, you lucky people, you haven't got any children to worry about.
In Northern Europe, the first civilians to experience the nightmare of fast-moving modern war were in the towns that stood in the way of the German army's blitzkrieg. In Poland, and then the Low Countries and France, hundreds of thousands of refugees took to the roads.
Exode douloureux que la guerre à la manière allemande fit souvent tragique. Ont en Belgique et en France surtout incendiés et massacrés en attentats inexpiables contre villes ouvertes et villages.
What the refugees came to fear most were attacks from the air, even as they fled.
Stukas starten zum Feindflug. Wo sie zupacken, verbreiten sie Angst und Verderben.
In the column trailing out of the Belgian town of Louvain was 20-year-old Pierre Rondas with his family.
Maar dat had een speciaal geluid, die Stukas, in die duikvluchten.
The Stukas had a special sound when they were diving. There was the noise of the planes and also the machine guns.
En iedereen haaste zich van de weg af om in de gracht.
Everyone rushed off the road to take cover in the ditches.
En dan zag je daar mensen die bebloed was de baan.
We saw people standing there covered with blood, as well as people thrown down on the ground. Some of them may have been dead. I stood there, but I couldn't wait any longer. You have only one thing in your mind. You just have to keep going, keep going.
U ging maar.
On the side that seemed to be winning, civilians' experience was different. Germans on the home front believed they were safe and were confident of ultimate victory. Everyone had a part to play in the war effort. In Hamburg, children were sent to find scrap. Horst Westphal collected old meat bones to help make explosives.
We used to ring the bell and greet them smartly at the door.
Heil Hitler.
Heil Hitler.
Haben Sie Knochen?
Do you have any bones?
Und dann kam die Hausfrau mit einem Paket oder was sie
And then the housewives would come out with a packet or whatever they'd collected them in. The next day we took the bones to school and handed them in.
Und da wurden die Knochen dann abgegeben.
Hamburg schoolgirls like Margareta Zettel helped to run the trams.
In the afternoons, as so-called bell ferries, we used to take the tram. We had to push the passengers into the tram. Then ring the bell. You had to ring the bell so the driver knew he could go.
Hamburg was a center of war production. The Germans had started preparing much earlier than their enemy.
Calling all workers.
British war production had to catch up fast. Factories were converted to turn out arms. A whole new workforce was mobilized.
Nearly 2,000 of us girls work in this factory. We work a 10-hour shift, 2 weeks on nights, 2 weeks on days.
Soon all unmarried women between 20 and 30 were called up, many of them to do technical jobs.
I'm the girl that makes the thing, that drills the hole, that holds the string, that drives the rod, that turns the knob, that works the thingamy-bob. It's a tickly sort of job, making a thing for a thingamy-bob. Especially when you don't know what it's for, but it's the girl that...
In conscripting women, Britain went further than ever before to meet the demands of war.
And it's the girl that makes the thing, that holds the oil and oils the spring, that works the thingamy-bob, that's going to win the war.
The horrors predicted in the 1930s were soon borne out. People working in war factories found that they themselves became targets.
Pausenlos brausen die deutschen Geschwader nach England. Tag und Nacht belegen sie London mit Millionen Kilo von Bomben.
Before America itself joined the war, President Roosevelt had taken the moral high ground and appealed to both sides not to bomb civilians. But a steady escalation began. When German planes attacked London in September 1940, they tried to hit the docks and stations. but mostly they hit the streets and homes surrounding them. And that winter, as Londoners sheltered from the Blitz where they could, Hitler hoped he could break their morale with the destruction that came each night. No other British city was bombed as intensively as Plymouth with its naval dockyards. On the night of the worst raid in 1941, Betty Lawrence was training as a midwife at the General Hospital.
It was so frightening. You could hear these planes and the noise of the sirens and everything going. And then they were overhead, and the next minute, whoosh, a bomb dropped on the children's ward. And this poor lady, we just sat and we hugged each other, and the lights went out, and the debris was falling down. And this poor woman, she said, the baby's coming, the baby's coming. And there was this baby, and I had to deliver this baby with torchlight, with muck and dirt and dust. And this poor woman, we were covered with dust.
More than 1,000 people were killed and 3,000 injured in the raids.
That was terrible, walking through Plymouth. No buildings at all, absolutely nothing. You couldn't believe it. You just, where am I? Where is Plymouth? Where is it? You couldn't find the road. You picked your way over rubble all the way out to this hospital. And then I felt sadness, despair. It's the only time during the war that I felt a sense of defeat, that we're finished.
As the bombers returned again and again, people trekked out of Plymouth before dark. Half the population slept in open country in bitter March weather. Sid Newham had lost 3 members of his family in the raids.
We went up on the moors because we were really scared stiff. And we used to snuggle down amongst the edges. I used to get my little sister snuggled into me one side and my brother the other side. Then the bombs would start dropping. Then you could see the sky starting to light up. You think, wonder what part of town it is this time.
The government worried that morale in Plymouth was collapsing.
And in the midst of it all, the cry goes up, here comes Winston, the Prime Minister of Great Britain and his wife, come to be with the indomitable people of Devon.
We will mete out to the Germans the measure, and more than the measure. They have meted out to us.
Yes, I thought if they can do this to us, do it to children, we should do it to them. I know it wasn't a nurse's philosophy at all to feel like that, but that's the way I felt then. Do it to them, yes. Bomb Germany.
Because military targets were hard to hit, the British switched to area bombing. The RAF would try to stop German industry by dehousing its workers. In July 1943, they mounted their heaviest raids so far.
The sky was filled with the drone we hadn't heard before. The noise of the engines was so loud, everything was vibrating. So we realized that we were in for it today.
Hamburg, second largest city of the Reich, is being liquidated in a series of record attacks by the RAF. More bombs have fallen on Hamburg in the space of a few hours than on the whole of Greater London during the Blitz.
The British bombing created a firestorm with winds of 120 miles an hour. A Hamburg fireman, Hans Brunswick, had a cine camera with him.
That's a tobacconist right next door to the fire station. And you can see the unbelievable force behind the flames. The fire was unusual because it moved so fast. All our previous experiences were turned on their head. The way the fire joined up through all the streets, there'd never been anything like this before.
Temperatures reached 1,000 degrees centigrade. 8 square miles were ablaze. Margareta Zettel was caught in the middle of it.
It was an inferno, pure chaos. There was an unbelievable storm. The next thing we noticed was the disgusting smell. I still have it in my nostrils now. Blood, mortar, Everything was burning. The mixture was absolutely gruesome.
Grauenhaft gewesen. Margareta Zettel rescued 6 babies from the upper floors of a building on fire.
I brought the last child out, thank God, and immediately the burning stairs behind me collapsed.
For her bravery, she later received a medal in Berlin.
Eine Abordnung ausgezeichneter Jungen und Mädel Hamburgs in der Reichshauptstadt. Die Mädelführerin Margarete Zettel barg aus einem brennenden Säuglingsheim alle Kinder, bis die Flammen auch ihr Kleid erfasst hatten.
Mir waren die Haare abgebrannt.
My hair was burnt off, right up to the edge of the steel helmet I was wearing.
Der Stahlhelm war, waren mir die Haare abgebrannt.
The number of civilians killed in Hamburg that week was 42,000, more than all the British deaths in the whole of the Blitz. The homeless and dazed survivors gathered on any open ground.
Sie waren verzweifelt.
They were in despair. They were crying out for their families.
Ein Chaos der Gefühle.
It was a chaos of feelings and pain, spiritual and physical pain.
Selbstverständlich war man auch.
Of course.
Gebrochen.
We were broken.
Two-thirds of the residents left the city. Horst Westphal's home had been destroyed.
We
walked for 10 kilometers through rubble, debris and a sea of flames. There was a whole stream of refugees. We looked back at Hamburg and everything was black. The sky was totally black. The sun couldn't shine through. And even 25 kilometers away, soot was raining down.
That year, the propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, had asked Germans to embrace the idea of total war.
What total war really meant then, Goebbels didn't tell us. We felt very clearly what he meant in July 1943 in Hamburg.
Im Juli 1943 in Hamburg sehr deutlich. Das war totaler Krieg.
That was total war, but it just didn't happen as Goebbels had imagined.
When the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor in 1941, the war had been widened still further. President Roosevelt threw the weight of American industry into war production.
The militarists of Berlin and Tokyo started this war, but the massed, angered forces of common humanity will finish it.
It's a big changeover. Where we used to make hubcaps, now we're making helmets. Machine guns now, where they used to make typewriters. They're making bomb noses now, where they used to make lamps.
America saw itself as the arsenal of democracy, supplying both its own needs and its allies too. Americans traveled thousands of miles to take new war jobs. When a big West Coast shipyard couldn't find enough workers, it recruited them from all over the country.
People from myriad walks of life. The professor, housewife, bank clerk, school teacher. Less than 2% had seen a shipyard or even a ship.
one of the famous Henry Kaiser shipyards, the Brockmiller family have established an amazing record in the annals of shipbuilding. Headed by the father, every one of the family's 15 adults, including the girls, is helping build America's Liberty ship.
There we are.
They're up there in the top corner.
Top corner. All the Brockmillers that live in the American Midwest, we all decided to come 1,700 miles to Portland to work in the shipyards. Took us 4 days to get here.
On payday, each member of the family invests...
Getting our paycheck, $70 a week. That's what we got. At that time, there was a lot of money.
The Brockmillers, a family of patriots. Workers on the home front, all helping to win the war.
The pressure of war forced new and quicker methods. Ships were built in record time. Prefabricated sections were welded together to make hundreds of Liberty cargo ships. The driving force was the industrialist Henry Kaiser. He was still learning the job, like most of his workforce. Yet one of his San Francisco yards broke all records by showing it could launch a ship only 4.5 days after laying the keel.
A cheer went up that echoed round the world, a tribute to the determined men and women who had accomplished the amazing feat of launching a completed ship in 4 days, 15 hours, and 27 minutes.
I think working in the shipyards was quite an experience myself. There was lots of women there, probably more women than men. A lot of women didn't work before that, and that'd give them all a job. It'd help support the family.
Today's beauty contests are in the shipyards, on the assembly lines. Here at Marinship, California, women welders have a lunchtime contest. Men workers vote on each girl's appearance, job record, and attendance. For now, Miss America is at work.
But not enough were at work, and Washington fought shy of industrial conscription. So all the government could do was talk tough.
Too many of us still haven't buckled down to the job and raised the sweat that victory demands. We are sending out to fight for us the finest young men any nation ever called to its colors. They can never win if they have to fight this year's war with weapons we produce next year. What are we going to do about it? I'll tell you, if you and everyone with you starts tomorrow to put that extra drive and anger and determination into the job, we'll win this war in spite of all the odds.
Keep punching the clock until you knock out the foe. Don't stay away or you'll be missing the show. If you want your country free, don't be an absentee.
Граждане и гражданки Советского Союза, сегодня в 4 часа утра, без объявления войны, германские войска напали на нашу страну, атаковали наши границы во многих местах.
Total war was waged most harshly in the Soviet Union. In 1941, the Soviet people were invaded by German forces who had orders to kill or enslave them and take over the land. Soviet prisoners were treated as subhumans.
Das sind die stumpfsinnigen, aber gefügigen Werkzeuge der politischen Sowjetkommissare. Die Männer, die die Faschisten mit dem Daumen zerdrücken wollten.
Everywhere the Germans advanced, they rounded up civilians and split up families. Women and children were sent away to fend for themselves. They picked out some to be deported as slave laborers back in Germany. Many would never return. Alexandra Sakharova was sent to work on a farm in Bavaria.
My working day was 16 to 17 hours long. It was heavy work, with the sun and everything. I wasn't used to it, because I'd never worked in agriculture before. But what else could I do? I had to work.
The Soviet people who were left behind were engulfed in a war that took more civilian lives than in any other country. They were often caught between the German occupation forces and the resistance waged by Soviet partisans. In the village of Alexandrovo, near Minsk, Serafima Shipko lived in fear of both sides.
It was frightening to live with the expectation of death. When night fell, someone would tap on our windows. An armed man, but who was it? Which do you like, Germans or partisans? The one who comes with a gun you love.
The Germans took ruthless reprisals after partisan activity. Soldiers were told the normal rules of war need not be followed.
The big German commander came in and ordered that the men should be shot and the village burnt. They shot my brother and his 2 sons in one hut. They would take people to a shed and burn them there.
Like thousands of other Soviet villages, Alexandrovo was burnt to the ground. Chinese civilians received much the same treatment from the Japanese, who'd been at war in China since 1937. The Japanese, too, wanted living space and territory, and also treated their enemy as inferiors, whose lives were cheap. One of the Japanese who took part in atrocities was Hakudo Nagatomi.
First we tried using karate on them, but it wasn't easy to kill them that way. Then a Japanese officer stepped forward and said, "You lot from Tokyo, watch this. I'll show you how it's done." He got his sword, washed it with water, and then he grabbed the Chinese soldier nearest him. He pushed him and made him bend forward. He struck him with a single stroke from behind, so that his head just rolled off.
Japanese troops were given orders to make the land uninhabitable. The Imperial Army's slogan was the 3 alls.
Burn all, steal all, kill all. That means if there were people, kill them. If there was a house, burn it. If there were cows or sheep, slaughter them.
Hakudo Nagatomi believes he killed about 100 Chinese himself. He's still haunted by the memory.
I rounded up the women and children in the villages, shut them into buildings, piled up firewood and burned them. I did many terrible things like that.
The Japanese also seized people to be forced laborers. Millions of civilians from China and Korea were used to build roads and railways and work in the mines. Yan Pyeon-tu was helping his neighbor plant rice in Korea when he was kidnapped by Japanese police. He was sent to Japan in a ship full of other Koreans. They were put to work on a hydroelectric scheme near Tokyo. Their families had no idea where they were.
There would be a line of guards standing there, and they beat and kicked us in turn. Our backs ached so much, but when we stood up like this to stretch, we would be beaten hard. That's the way they treated us. My arm was broken like this. Even so, I had to keep on working. But despite working on, they would still come and say, "Faster, faster, you scum."
In the Soviet Union, the extraordinary privations of one city became a symbol for the suffering of all Russian civilians. By the late summer of 1941, Leningrad's 3 million citizens had all been mobilized to build defenses. The Germans were already in the suburbs. Elena Taranukina was a piano teacher, unused to heavy labor.
My hands became like a man's hands, strong hands. Even now they're stronger than before. I tried to dig these trenches longer and deeper, in the hope that the part I dug would stop a tank.
Leningrad, die Geburtsstätte des Bolschewismus, ist völlig eingeschlossen und liegt im vernichtenden Feuer der deutschen Batterien.
In September, a siege began that was to last 2.5 years. As the first winter set in, the food warehouses emptied. The bread ration was cut to 125 grams a day for most civilians, a slice and a half. Even then, it reeked of mold and malt.
It was gluey, like putty. It wasn't even brown, it was greenish-grey in colour. It actually tasted terrible, but it seemed delicious to us. I wouldn't eat it now.
In a winter of record cold, temperatures reached 40 degrees below freezing. But the cold brought one benefit. When the huge lake east of Leningrad froze over, it was possible for lorries to bring a trickle of food and supplies 20 miles across the ice from the far shore. The Germans failed to break the lifeline.
They reduced the bread ration 5 times. But when the ice road started functioning, the ration was gradually increased. The old women would go to the bakers and cross themselves because bread had appeared. They'd been saved.
But there still wasn't enough food to stop widespread starvation.
It was like a superstition. People could only survive if they stayed on their feet. There was something mystical about it. It was true. Those who lay down died.
On one day, Christmas Day 1941, 3,700 died. Elena Taranukina's mother went out of her mind.
Mama tried to bite a bit of flesh from my little daughter Leila. As she was quite a plump little child, she wanted to eat her. So I never left my daughter on her own at home. I took her with me every time I went to queue at the baker's. My mother died soon after.
The city's radio orchestra struggled to keep playing, but it no longer had enough musicians. A Leningrad composer, who also worked as a fire warden, was writing a piece of music that became inextricably linked with the city's resistance. He was Dmitry Shostakovich.
Моя 7-я симфония навеяна грозными событиями 1941 года. Нашей борьбе с фашизмом, нашей грядущей победе над врагом, моему родному городу Ленинграду я посвящаю это сочинение.
The orchestra's conductor bicycled round the city to find musicians to play it, but many were too weak. Ksenia Matus was the second oboe.
When the rehearsals were in progress, people had no energy, especially the brass section. And the first trumpet, instead of playing, put his instrument like this and just sat there. The conductor, Karl Ilyich, stopped the orchestra. Why aren't you playing? Karl Ilyich, I have no more strength. You've got no more strength. Do you think we have? But the concert must go ahead, so you must play. One musician was late for rehearsal. Why are you late? Asked the conductor. Karl Ilyich, my mother died. Well, don't let it happen again. He meant not be late again, not that his mother shouldn't die again.
They were reduced to making bread from wood cellulose and sawdust. Soup was made from glue. Arms workers tried to keep the factories going. More than 750,000 people died of cold, hunger, and disease. One Russian wrote in his diary, "Taking a body to the cemetery exhausts the last vestiges of strength in the survivors, and so the living, in fulfilling their duty to the dead, are brought to the brink of death themselves." On the day the symphony was performed, the Red Army created a diversion to draw German fire away from the hall. In the Soviet total war, the symphony was a gesture of defiance and was broadcast across the country.
When we finished the symphony, the hall was dead silent. And then suddenly there was a storm of applause. A girl came up from the audience with a bunch of flowers. She gave them to the conductor. Can you imagine fresh garden flowers during the blockade? It was unbearably joyful.
The girl who presented the flowers was Lubov Zhakova. They'd been grown by her uncle, who took her to the concert.
I was pushed into the middle, and there was nothing else for me to do but present the flowers. And there was a note inside them. I still remember it to the last word. With gratitude for preserving symphonic music. We were overcome most of all by a feeling of celebration and grandeur, joy that we would be victorious.
The siege was finally lifted in 1944 after 890 days. By then, American supplies were reaching the Allies in growing numbers.
The outpouring of America, industrial giant bound for invasion.
For the invasion of France, which would start the final campaign in Europe, huge stockpiles were built up.
The arsenal of determined armies and the wheels of victory. An avalanche of production by a free people rushing like a torrent to engulf a tyrant.
War factory workers give General Montgomery a great reception when he comes to talk to them about their essential part in the waging of war.
Why is it that today the tide has turned and we are beating the Germans and coming towards the final climax of the war? I'll tell you why it is. It's because we've got far the best equipment and we've got far the best men. And women too. Far the best.
This is no time to say you've done enough. This is the time to really do your stuff. And even if you can't be a soldier in the ranks, you can be the guy to help supply the guns and planes and tanks. This is the time for you to do your best. This is no time for you to take a rest. The enemy is reeling and his morale is low. So now's the time to fall in line, deal the final blow.
The end of the war was in sight in Europe, and the final blows were to be delivered against Japan from a new long-range bomber, the B-29, being mass-produced by American workers.
We, the people, built it. We conceived it, financed it, gave it wings. Here the bomb bays will hold the greatest weight of death ever lifted into the skies. The function of the people's superfortress is to break the race who turn their backs on reason, to spin them around to face the peaceful way of living.
The Japanese, in turn, were being asked to do more by their own government. Children were taken out of school and sent to the arms factories to work full-time, so desperate was the labor shortage. Whole classes worked together. At the age of 12, Katsumoto Saotomi helped to produce grenades.
The school wanted us to look military, and I've kept this over the years. It says kamikaze in Japanese. It's read from right to left. Our teachers told us that in Japan we have an emperor who is descended from the gods. So whatever happens, in the end a divine wind will blow and win the war for us. And we used to tie this round our heads before we went to the factory.
Japan's child laborers began each day with an assembly at the factory. As the Japanese forces were pushed back, civilians braced themselves for the war now coming to the home islands.
I've got a message that I want you to take over there for me, and I want you to deliver it. I want you to deliver it when you make that first raid on Tokyo.
How about it, boy?
Yeah. To the warlords of Japan, we have not forgotten, and our B-29 will remind you again and again and again. Good luck. God bless you.
Thanks very much, sir.
By 1945, the Americans had island bases close enough for the B-29s to take off for Japan. They attacked all major cities, but the raid on Tokyo on March the 10th was the most lethal. Katsumoto Saotomi woke up as the planes came over at midnight.
It was a B-29 as close as the ceiling above me, larger than anything I've ever seen. It didn't seem that it could be human. I felt it was something out of this world, like a devil, or that Satan himself had appeared.
Earlier concerns in the West about the morality of bombing civilians were long forgotten. After 5 years, all the constraints had gone. In one night, the Americans dropped 500,000 incendiary bombs to set Tokyo alight.
When I opened the door, it was almost as if a red wind was blowing. There was so much smoke that you couldn't even see from here to the house just opposite.
The roofs of the houses were popping up like this, and tiles were flying off into the air.
Bedding, broken wood, bits of doors, things like that came flying at us. Then they fell on people running away and set them alight. Their hair caught fire. I saw a woman standing there burning. People writhing around in agony, in a ball of fire.
There was no way of stopping the fires. Sumiko Morikawa had her twin babies strapped to her back and her 4-year-old son Kichi in her arms. She jumped into a half-full swimming pool.
We were in the water right beneath a burning school, and for several hours, until the school burnt down, we had to endure a shower of sparks and embers. I could feel the babies on my back getting heavier and heavier. They were kicking me on both sides.
As the fire moved away, Mrs. Morikawa managed to clamber out of the pool.
Around the pool were heaps of bodies. You couldn't even tell if they were men or women. And the children, they were lying just like dummies all over the place. You could almost say you had to kick them out of the way to get through.
Once out of the water, she put Kichi down and managed to untie the babies from her back.
The two of them were just like dolls. Their faces were white, and they were dead. I put a little water in Kiichi's mouth, and he was good enough to drink it for me. But that was really his last gasp. He said "Mummy" to me in a very low voice. And then he just faded away. I thought I was doing all I could to protect them. But in the end, I wasn't able to save any of them.
The B-29s, built to carry the greatest weight of death ever lifted into the skies, had achieved their purpose. 334 planes killed 120,000 people in a few hours, more than any other single action in the war. Though they knew they could never win, the Japanese leaders told their people to fight on and spoke of ever greater sacrifices to come. Emperor Hirohito, in whose name the Japanese were fighting, visited the smoldering remains of the capital.
他国も天皇陛下におかせられましては3月18日帝都天災地に聖火を進めさせたまえ敵機夜間猛爆による災害の模様を親しく見備わせられました
5 months later, the technology of total war reached its zenith. It took only one plane and one bomb to devastate Hiroshima and later Nagasaki in just a few seconds. Japan's leaders surrendered.
I looked up at the sky and I thought, what's this war all been for? Have we really lost it? If so, what did my children die for?
In Europe, the fighting was already over. Altogether, the war had cost 55 million lives, 6 times as many as in the First World War. What was new was not just the numbers, but who they were. Up to 13 million civilians in China. Up to 14 million Soviet civilians. They were women and babies, old men and boys, victims of starvation, atrocities, and bombing. 6 million of them were Jews, victims of genocide. For the first time, far more civilians had lost their lives than soldiers in uniform. Survivors and refugees took to the roads once again.
These are a few of the millions of people who were once labor slaves of the Nazis and who are now trying desperately to get home. Home to a little farm in Poland. Home to a tiny coastal village in Normandy. Home to Leningrad, 3,000 miles away.
Like countless others, Alexandra Sakharova made her own way home from Bavaria to Leningrad.
Sometimes I had to travel on the roof or walk barefoot. This took a long time, about a month and a half. When I returned to Leningrad, it was bitter to see the city destroyed, but it was a joy to be home.